Hello and welcome, Marcus, to Func Prog Sweden.
Hey, thank you.
You're
Good to be
welcome.
here. Super excited.
Yes,
Yeah.
hello. Warm welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hand
Can I
it
get
over to
started?
you.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, great presentation from Ria. Thank you so much. And I guess I'm at the mid. I'm calling in from Houston, so I'm at the middle of at the peak of my morning coffee experience. I don't think I can literally not stop talking. So if this is too long, just wave your hands or something. And let's see if I can switch. There we go. Yeah, so I discovered programming when I was about 10. Some basic, some Pascal, some C. I don't know if there's any old timers in the watching this, but there was an old video mode called Mode 13 back in the day where you could get 320 times 200 pixels worth of graphic data on the screen in a linear buffer. And that was my youth, probably, like drawing nice demographics programs and stuff like that. I sold my first piece of software when I was 15, content management system in Java. I didn't realize that I should probably have, made a company out of that back in the day when the web wasn't very dynamic. Had some sort of software development career in Stockholm, and I co-founded a company called Artilect around 2010, and I left there for an extended sabbatical around 2012. And then in 14, I co-founded a new startup with a doctor here in the Houston area called Sarma, Dr. Vadamori. And our job is to fight death with process improvement. So we're our first mission is to make sure people don't die of sepsis in hospitals. And I'm super excited about that because I think usually as a developer, I'm trying to look for things that I can make a living out of, but also has a meaning, because I think there's a lot of meaninglessness in the software space and IT space. So I'm super grateful that I got to be a part of this journey. Somewhere along the road, I started getting severe JavaScript fatigue. There was a bunch of reasons why we ended up on the JavaScript stack, primarily because we needed to be a hybrid app at the time. And gradually I was sinking into the famous tar pit, and things got slower and more cumbersome to work with. And so we switched to Clojure after having done some research. And 2 years ago, basically from a blank slate or vanilla, and still it was a massive success. So if there's anything I want to give you today, it's just the idea that we switched from a painful situation to Clojure, and we're super happy about it, despite having done a lot of mistakes along the way. And I hope to be able to communicate some of what was helpful for us, and we'll see about that along the way. Yeah. So we switched relatively unprepared under difficult circumstances, because basically when we were about to roll out our first big rewrite in ClojureScript, the COVID shutdown started happening over here, and we decided to pivot and try to use our technology to help screen for COVID and help keep some workplaces open. And that basically started a very, very intense year of trying to keep up with the pandemic from a software side and delivering solutions to people basically asking from the streets for it. And so if we could do it during these circumstances, I think anyone can do it under better circumstances. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, so the background here that we came into this with was we had a hybrid app based on the Cordova platform, so we could build native apps with JavaScript. This was this was the Angular 1 era, just before React took over. Anyone seeing Angular 1 and not getting PTSD is not probably a healthy person, but for a short while it seemed like that was the bee's knees, and then we quickly realized it wasn't. It was a Node backend, and gradually I was getting more JavaScript fatigue as I realized that the language itself was changing every other month, and the massive amount of libraries coming out, and just keeping up with everything. I think in the end it just wasn't very fun, and I had to learn how to navigate the JavaScript sort of problems, if you will. I sort of came into this from a sabbatical. I wasn't super warmed up, and had to figure out how to navigate around all the intricacies of JavaScript. And I think I came up with a very functional oriented approach and basically just passing a bunch of maps around, which is the leading theme in the Clojure community. Like the main abstraction is to pass a bunch of maps around. But also the difficulty of applying a functional programming discipline while building a team, because it's possible to do functional programming in JavaScript, like Ria pointed out in the previous talk, but it's a discipline and it requires, it takes a bunch of effort and energy and reviews and education in order to do it in a scaling way. So why would you consider switching? Why would we consider switching? The way I see it is that software development is annoyingly hard, and I started looking for things to make it easier and better. And there was a bunch of things pointing to Clojure at the same time. The Beating the Averages Graham article that many are referring to definitely was high impact for me. Also a bunch of testimonies about a small group of people accomplishing great things. And you'll see, if you start researching this, you'll see a bunch of FUD too, seeing that, you know, Clojure is not super popular, it should have taken off by now, yada, yada, yada. But every now and then I would see these testimonies that would say something completely different. And being a small team and having a lot of work to do ahead of us, like we have a lot of products that we want to build. I started realizing that things could be done differently, and I wanted to try to build a team that was doing something special, and where we had high leverage on every developer. And I think I was very proud of our work, our first product and our launches. Back then we had some 5 hospitals, I think, and we've written a massive amount of code in very short time. But I wasn't very proud of the code base. It was more like, hey, you know, I got this Frankenstein's monster walking, and, you know, has stilts and stuff, and it doesn't fall at all. And I'm like, that's not a very proud, like, I wasn't very proud about it. I was proud about the product and what it accomplished, but I wasn't proud about the code base. Or I could be, but it required some background and explanation, you know, hey, and I have a rule in the company which says you can't judge another person's code until you know the situation it was written in. And from that standpoint, the code was great. It was awesome because it was written under a lot of pressure. But objectively, in some degree of objectivity, it wasn't something I was super proud of. Okay, moving on. Yeah, so one of those testimonies is from a guy on Netflix. You've probably seen this if you watched a bunch of Clojure talks, but I'm just going to read it out. A lot of the best programmers and the most productive programmers I know are writing everything in Clojure and swearing by it, and then just producing ridiculously sophisticated things in a very short time. And that programmer productivity matters. And I 100% agree. And I think this was one of the most inspiring quotes for me to hold on to while I contemplated switching. That's a rather remarkable statement, I would say. Yeah, and it wouldn't be a Clojure talk if we didn't quote a dictionary of some sort. And everyone knows that the only real dictionary on the internet is the hacker jargon file. So the right thing, capital R, capital T, that which is compellingly the correct or appropriate thing to use, do, say, etc. Often capitalized, always emphasized in speech as though capitalized. Many of use of this term often implies that there's a fact that in fact reasonable people may disagree. What is the right thing for a Lisp to do when it sees mod A0, etc., etc. Yeah. And I started to see that switching to Clojure was the right thing. And that means, you know, roll up your sleeves and get to work when you see a right thing out there that hasn't been followed. Yeah, so the issues with JavaScript and the situation we were in, you all know as functional interested programmers, is, you know, state would be the main thing. Angular 1 is notorious for doing bidirectional state, which it becomes ridiculously complicated pretty much at once. It's a very humbling experience to think that you're smart enough to handle it, you know, and but also the normal stuff, you know, impurity, and that the applying functional programming would like save us, but it's also had to be applied as a discipline. And the main thing I've highlighted here is the JavaScript fatigue. I have to testify, guys, I'm 8 years soon. I'm in my 8th year of this startup. I don't remember when I learned something new, and I have absolutely zero fatigue, and I'm more excited about development than I've ever been. That was not the case 2 years ago. Also growing a team, there was an unexpected cost of opinions and an unexpected cost of decisions. Trying to be like sort of graduate from being the solo developer to a lead developer to a team lead or a manager was very, very hard, because you have to sort of do your day job as a developer and keep the servers alive and all of that, while like building a team around that. And all of a sudden I realized that opinions cost a lot and they're super expensive to enforce. And in the end, I think the main issue was it wasn't fun anymore, development in general. And I think you all have heard this story before of grumpy old developers turning to Clojure. And Clojure has answers to this. Immutability, concurrency, conciseness, even stability, like language stability. I've got some negative feedback from a disgruntled employee that was not happy about the switch, saying that, thank you, I got some coffee coming in here, thank you, Aaron. Saying that that the language has stagnated, just look at the language updates. And I'm like, that's the point. You know, it doesn't move all the time. It doesn't change every other month, you know. It's all good, we talked it out, and I think that's in part because it's a mature language and a very, very, very nice standard library, but also that it has macros. So the language, the evolvement of the language is built into the language. It's extremely minimalistic. It has a lot of opinions and it's super fun. I'm just gonna put it that bluntly. Yeah, so too long didn't read, or whatever that means. Every step of the way, every switch we made or everything we rolled out, every milestone was a massive success from day one. And the thing that we kept saying was we should have done it sooner. The first web app rewrite was like a just day and night difference in the quality of the code. And the first start of using ClojureScript instead of just plain old JavaScript for Node on the back end was also a massive success from day one, although like ClojureScript and Node with the like sort of heavy promise-based JavaScript landscape can be a little bit awkward, or you get less bang for the buck from ClojureScript. It was still a massive success. The first time we made a project in Clojure proper on the JVM, this was actually started by two guys who came from the JavaScript ClojureScript side, and they've never used the JVM before. So when I say Clojure proper, I mean Clojure on the JVM as opposed to JavaScript, ClojureScript on Node or in the front end. And the guy calls me like at 10 p.m. at night, and he's like absolutely blown away. He's like, yeah, I've done ClojureScript for many years. I didn't get the whole thing about the REPL-driven development. And he's like, I can't believe we ever did anything different than this. And like it somehow produces joy and happiness. And I think I have some clues about why that is. But and then the milestone of getting a full sort of proper backend going in Clojure was also a success from day one. Yeah. So JavaScript as an entry point to Clojure and ClojureScript, I think should be highlighted a little bit, because I think a lot of people are stuck in the JavaScript jungle or tar pit, if you will. The tar pit refers to a paper written on how to do software better out of the tar pit. Thank you, Jeb, for giving me the paper. Read it and get wiser. But yeah, so JavaScript as an entry point, I think could be highlighted a little bit, because I think many people are stuck there. So Angular, React, what's the next thing there? Angular, Redux, what's the next thing there? I started thinking about what that should be. And I saw React Redux as something that was way better than Angular, but clearly like not finished in some sense. And it seemed like an approach, but wasn't really wrapped up. And I started looking around, and that's when I found ClojureScript actually. And like you have to use Redux or immutable JavaScript, immutable JS, because there's no standard library to handle all of that. And then the realization that Clojure actually has a standard library, that's how hostage everyone is by the JavaScript scene. Like we're all getting used to not having a standard library, and that's almost no exaggeration. Like the amount of dependencies we have in our projects now is very, very small. And I used to see these like long lists of, you know, warnings of dependencies and security issues with some obscure JavaScript library because everything became an npm package because there's no standard library. Another sort of important point along the way for me was learning about Reframe or reading about it. Reframe is a front-end, I guess, library or approach for ClojureScript that has that sort of has an approach that is similar to Redux, but a couple of orders of magnitude higher, or a couple of abstractions higher up, if you will. I think it made me smarter just reading about it and pondering why it was the way it was. And the one thing it does that was new for me was separating the name of an event from the event handler, from the name of an effect from the effect handler. So one thing that used to be one thing is now like 4 or 5 things. And all of a sudden things get very, very simple. And I think ClojureScript is way ahead of the game when it comes to figuring out those abstractions. And I think it's because of the functional sort of underlying paradigm and in trying to make things pure. Yeah, if you haven't noticed yet, my approach to this is a little bit shotgunny, like it's all over the place, because my idea is to give out breadcrumbs, of things that people can maybe pick up on and be inspired by or run away from if you're in that inclination. Yeah, so same language front-end and back-end. It was very, very attractive when we started out with JavaScript. It's still true on ClojureScript, with ClojureScript and Clojure, to not have to context switch and not have to learn multiple paradigms. And I still think the ClojureScript on Node as an introduction is a very good entry point, because you don't have to change any of your stack or your deployment options. And maybe a first attempt at switching, if you feel inclined to that, is rewriting just a single module of Node code tree to ClojureScript. I wish I did that, and I wish I did it way sooner, because it's easier than replacing the whole stack and all the CI pipelines and stuff like that. And this idea of like Node.js being asynchronous, no one uses the asynchronicity, and everyone just waits and tries to get away from it. So they're sort of almost working against the paradigm itself. And those, by using promises and that sort of syntax notation of or hack, I would say, with the async await, and the whole like Node.js is surprisingly hard to work with once you start to look around a little bit, and promises work great, but it's also awkward compared to just going bottoms up as traditionally. I don't know if that point was well made, but there's something there to explore. Still worth it was my point, I guess, even if you have to do awkward promise-based development in ClojureScript. Moving on. Yeah, our first production code was a backend worker service in ClojureScript. It was a great success, and we only did it because that team hadn't discovered Clojure proper yet. But it's possible to do this. Man, I got a lot of slides on Clojure for the backend. I'm just gonna move on actually. Yeah, so one thing that I really wish we switched to Clojure proper sooner. And one thing that delayed that was we were under such heavy pressure product-wise. We needed to develop features and people asking about it, big cities in the US. And we didn't have time to stop and breathe and reconsider our infrastructure and deployment options. So at that point, we had a Node backend, and we deployed it in one of those magical, run your Node code here, cloud machine type thingy. And it supposedly should scale infinitely and do all kinds of magical things. And then you press the wrong button and everything, breaks as normal. And I don't know if this makes sense to anyone, but that made the whole switching scenario way harder. And I think looking back, I should have added an external team to help us switch with the infrastructure. We ended up moving away from the magical cloud machine thingy to just virtual machines, and putting a reverse proxy in front of or behind the load balancer, and basically putting up a Clojure backend in parallel with the Node backend, and implemented basically what they would call in modern cloud architecture for the strangler pattern, or just like gradually moving functionality over from one to the other. the old Node backend is still alive, and it's yeah, it's very, very like legacy heavy, and I think we had an experienced Clojure team. We got some help from Cognitect at that point, the creators of Clojure, and we had some very, very experienced Clojure guys that I think we underutilized because we hadn't switched to Clojure proper yet, and what happened instead, because they were uncomfortable with Node, was that we put a lot of functionality into Postgres and the database instead. So we had these massively complicated database things going on just because we were trying to not be adding more complexity to the Node backend. What we should have done was, as soon as we had that team on, I should have paid an extra 20K to have a DevOps team come in and figure this out. It would have been more utilization for the money, but it's always easy to be wise in retrospect. But for anyone who is about to embark on this journey, like, spend some time thinking about infrastructure first, only to optimize so that you can for switching as soon as possible. That would be my recommendation. Yes, we also started by writing the front-end app in ClojureScript and keeping the Node.JS backend the way it was. And the idea behind that was that we had a team of JavaScript developers and like one new ClojureScript guy as we were transitioning. And looking back, it would have been better to start with the backend, even though the front end was the one that sort of opened the door to ClojureScript for us. It would have been better to utilize the team that knew how to build React apps in JavaScript, do that, and then transition to the backend. But all of this unfolded very gradually for us. So again, I'm putting this out there for someone who's may potentially walk down the similar path. I'd love to chat about the various options and how to optimize for team utilization, because I think even as we did it, it was definitely the right call, but we could have been smarter looking back. Yeah, so the one thing you do to sell it internally is to have people as soon as possible do REPL-driven development on the JVM. It is a fantastic development experience. It drastically reduces the time from like playing around with an idea to actual implementation code. I would almost argue that it almost reduces or removes the distinction between playing around and writing production code. The difference is when I ship some code to production, I remove the comment block that shows you exactly how I played around with the code. And I even put a point here about saving that clutter code around because it's a good sort of introduction to the code for the next person coming. So when you're a junior team and everyone's learning together, it may be helpful to see what sort of what document strings had, or what documentation had to be looked up, etc., etc. So the feeling of working in the REPL is the code gradually evolves, and you just sort of sit there and play around and poke around with it. And every time I feel like I stagnated or like I'm not being super productive, it's always because I forgot to run the code or execute the code. I'm either up in my head or I'm like writing a whole bunch of, this is the international sign of programming, but I'm writing a bunch of code, and instead of executing it and going gradually, and I think the REPL and the approach in the Clojure community encourages running code a lot, and it brings you closer to the code and closer to the problem, closer to the data. It's closer. I mean, closer within this. And the feeling of it is that it's a little bit like TDD, but less strict. And it's easy to sort of graduate from playing around in writing proper tests, but yeah, moving on. I do want to say something about TDD that I think for the first couple of weeks of doing Clojure, it was super helpful for me. I did it just for my own learning experience. And before you figure out what some of the nuances are, the various collection types and how to convert between them, and how to check for equality and all of that, and just to make sure that your code is doing what you think it does, you could get bitten by lazy evaluation and all of that. So I like that people are not super religious about test-driven development in the Clojure space, and there may even be a mocking attitude. Like there's definitely a type of religiosity in the Clojure community, And I agree with most of it, but for me, when I switched, doing TDD was super helpful. Clojure has an awesome just built-in testing library, and doing REPL-driven, test-driven development is just a pleasure. It's awesome. Yeah, so that was helpful for me. I'm trying to get my team to do it as well. Oh yeah, so I want to talk a little bit of like last week on this meetup, there was a bunch of talk about the cognitive load of functional programming, and I want to, by doing state management properly, and I guess, or not doing state, not having state, and similar techniques. And I think I want to push a little bit on, or I want to add to that topic of reduced cognitive load, because I very, very much feel like that's an undersold thing. I felt like I calmed down like crazy after a couple of weeks of doing Clojure, and I just it's way more fun and less intense and less burdening to code now than it was before. I think traditionally, and I think Clojure has the same benefits as any other functional programming language applied properly when it comes to the traditional functional paradigm stuff, and that is very noticeable in the long term, in the sense that if you do proper state management and you do pure functions as much as possible and immutable data and all of that, after a while you just don't notice the decline, that like you just can keep going for way longer, and you have to look back and say, hey, why am I not in the tar pit? Like, we still have a steady pace, we're still making strides after a year into a massive stride or a massive sprint. And I think it's because of these functional paradigms. And in fact, we got a testimony from a seasoned SaaS customer success person that we onboarded, and he said, so this is 1 year into this COVID tool sprint, if you will, and everyone had worked a lot. He said, despite the various issues encountered over the last few days, not once was the software the issue. This is extremely rare, and I think this may be lost on everyone. I have been involved in many software implementations, and rarely, if ever, have I been a part of a software launch where there were no software bugs, scalability issues, etc. Bottom line, inoculate, that's a product that has been rock solid. The dev team should be extremely proud of this accomplishment, and the credit for a successful launch should be singularly given to them. After this, we got our first scalability issues, of course, right? Because we got prideful, and after this came some challenges. But this was literally 1 year into like working as fast as we can, and still like we could roll out software that didn't have any bugs. So that was amazing. And like it's all about the team, right? But also the right team with the right tools. Continuing on reduced cognitive load, I think the language of Clojure is a very, very good choice from this standpoint. I already said it made me calmer. I feel like I know fewer things. I can't remember when I had to learn something new. And I want to say that again to all the JavaScript people out there. I don't remember when I learned something new last time. And Clojure has this sort of simpleness and kindness to it. And it's hard to describe without using emotional words, but it just gets out of your way. And if you choose to get its help, there's a lot of really neat functions in there. And I think that's because it's well designed and because of the macro system. So anything that could be simplified with the help of a macro usually is. So in the end, even if a macro saves you 2 function calls, in the end, that's a 50% improvement of the amount of code you have to type. And that gives me the feeling of the people who have gone before me, Rich Hickey and everyone else who's worked on in the space, have almost like given me gifts, right? They've been considerate and thoughtful, and I can step in, sort of walk in their footsteps and enjoy the benefits of their thought works. So it turns out that cognitive load was an explicit design objective with Clojure. So I discovered it for myself, just that I calmed down a lot and I felt happier and more, more solid, I guess. And then as I was looking for a quote the other day, I found this in one of his speeches that he really set out to reduce cognitive load, and boy, he succeeded. Yeah, okay, so this is stepping into metaphysical territory. So if this is too weird for y'all, bear with me. It's only like 3 or 4 slides. But I think I want to point something out about the grammar and syntax and when I say Clojure, I may as well say Lisp, but because this applies to Lisps in general. And I think a lot of the things I'm talking about applies to Clojure specifically, but in this case, I think it applies to Lisp in general. And I think programming is about making distinctions, about things being different from each other. And usually when things are muddy or not clear, when someone's working on a problem and there seems to be some sort of conceptual confusion, it's usually when a thing is trying to be many things. I don't know what the correct anti-pattern name for that is, so I just call it a thing that tries to be many things. If you're on my team, you'll know about that anti-pattern. And that means distinctions need to be made, and a thing should be 2 or 3 or 4 things, etc. And so the act of making a distinction between one thing and another, or sort of splicing a thing up into many things, it's basically what we do, and it should be cognitive and typographically. I don't know if that's a word, and I don't know if it means what I think it means, but to type it out, it should be cheap. It should be cheap to make a distinction. That's my main point, both in your head and in your fingers and when looking at the screen. And in Clojure, it's always the same thing. It's always the same expression. It starts with the left parent and it ends with the right one. And we call it the form, and that's what we operate with, right? I read a book when I was younger that blew me away called Laws of Form by George Spencer Brown. It's way over my head, and I think it's a super interesting book about basically making distinctions, and he builds up an algebra that's sort of pre-algebraic algebra, if you will. It drops from grammar into sort of pure logic, if you will, and then sort of recreates a new grammar that's simpler. And it made a huge impact on me in that I was able, it was closer to how I was actually thinking. Like my mind doesn't speak equations to me. My mind speaks like distinctions and various paths that I choose. So when trying to work out an equation, like I can go this way or I can go that way, or like, hey, this thing actually needs to be a little bit different. So I was impressed by how this book tried to articulate some of those things and build an algebra around it. And even if the book itself, even if the grammar that's being recreated, he claims that he is proving the 4-color theorem that some of you may be familiar with, which it says that any map with countries on it can be colored in such a way that no 2 countries share bordering each other have the same color, and it can be done with 4 colors. And I honestly forgot that I think that it's proven in a number of ways now, but he claims to have a very elegant proof of it based off of this algebra. But for me, the main point was that he sort of detached from grammar and started over with something new. And the way he did that was by drawing circles and saying a circle is a distinction, and like the inside of the circle is different from the outside of the circle. And it made a huge impression on me. And I think, so when I came to Lisp and Clojure, I was sort of prepared because the parentheses, the parents, can be seen as a circle without the top and the bottom. This is literally from the Laws of Form book, and it could be, I think the rightmost form could be seen as the dry principle, you know, like if there are 2 distinctions and they have it marked to be differently, you can just have one of them instead. And the left one is a bit different. It says, if you transition over a distinction twice, you may as well remove the whole thing because it's worthless. Something like that. I forgot exactly what it was, but if you look at it this way, it kind of makes sense, and it's super close to. I think the right thing is a good illustration of how to look at a logic tree or a data that's being modeled, and the leftmost is the corresponding Clojure code, if you will, of traversing that tree. starting from the inside and out, of course. But so I think the main point here is loss of form, and the right-hand side of this slide is close to at least how I operate cognitively. It's an illustration of how I operate cognitively that's closer than usual mathematical algebra. And the leftmost is Clojure code. So like in some sense, at least I have been somewhat prepared for Clojure and Lisp, and I suspect it may be similar for others. Yeah, this was a bit pretentious, so but I wanted to try the idea out and see if I could articulate it and see if anyone else has anything to say in this matter, and maybe give a shout out to the loss of form book. It's super interesting, I think. I'm not sure I'm smart enough to make that judgment, but let me just get this. Here we go. So the idea here is that this sort of simple primary construct of the language does in the end result in a noticeable decrease in cognitive load, because you're doing the same thing all over. And if coding is about making distinctions, it's very hard to beat the representation of parentheses to distinguish something from that which is around it. So I think this may be a little bit of a strange point for some of y'all, but to me it seems relevant, and I think it matters, and I think it implies a deep level of consistency, and I think it comes out as a positive cognitive thing. I think others have had a similar experience, and this is from the also famous XKCD, and it's just one out of a sequence of comics, but or squares. But for a long time, when stepping into Clojure, I walked around and almost felt like I was going insane and thinking that, oh, it's all about the parentheses, you can just use it to represent everything, and yada yada. And in order to validate that I'm not insane, I've found some help in seeing that other people have had some similar experiences. Recommended reading for it, like just Google XKCD and Lisp if you want to see some more of it. Okay, this was late last night, guys. So it's the famous sage Confucius Rydberg who says, "When I see parents, I see not something else." And I think that the point here is the parenthesis is such a minimalistic expression of a distinction, and that when people complain about the massive amounts of right parents after an expression, I'm like, yeah, but the option is you put a bunch of other syntax garbage in between those parents, and then you're happy, right? Yeah, that was embarrassing. When the language is super simple, like it is, the data structures can also be upgraded to grammar, and I'm talking about the literal notations of vectors and maps, and it makes it pop out, and it makes it into very elegant, and like Ria actually shared earlier, it's very neat. Like it makes it very neat, the whole package of like data being super clear, code being super clear, and it has very, very little sort of gibberish around it. And I think the main point of of intersection between code and data, you hear everyone talk about code being data and data being code and all of that. I'm not sure what the meaning of that is, but I know that the keyword is somewhere in the middle, and it makes for very, very elegant code in transitioning between data and code. Moving on, I saw I already told you that the cost of opinions grew intensely so yeah, I guess we're out of the metaphysical strange portion of this, trying to comment on the grammar, bring it back to earth a little bit. But the cost of opinions grew higher quite significantly. And I already mentioned that the Clojure comes pre-packaged with it. It has immutable data structures. It has a bunch of ideas of how to do state with atoms and refs and all of that. And it's basically a bunch of decisions that I don't have to make myself. And that was very, very helpful. Okay, that got messed up. Yeah, so I had we had an intern just a couple of weeks ago, and I told him to go learn Clojure and come back to me. And he did come back to me after I hardly heard anything for 2 weeks, and then come back and asked him how it was going. And he said, well, it makes it really hard to change things. And I literally hired him on the spot. I'm like, bingo, that's the whole point. Hi, Jonathan. Good job, man. I guess he's no longer an intern, so I should change the title. I got through the journey of switching, I got one angry email from one of my favorite people who was not a fan of this. And I wanted to mention that too, because that did happen. It was not all sunshine and love, you know. And there was quite an intense email rant, you know, and we talked it out. But basically, this is the criticism that he put forth, and I asked him before if I was able to share some of this, and I wouldn't say anything I won't say to his face. So, but I want to share this though. That he made some points about popularity and that it being a dead language. And what I want to highlight is that it's stagnated and there's no language updates. And I already mentioned that that's a feature. And the popularity part could be argued, could not be argued. Like it may be a point. It may. I don't want to use any tools that are used only because of their popularity, which he also we talked about that. I want to use the right tool, the right thing, you know. Deployment had some criticism about the JVM not being super adopted on the cloud, which is also correct. I know the Clojure team has worked on that extensively though. There's a very, very small talent pool, and Newback bought Cognitect are sucking up all the talent. I think the talent pool size was overplayed as a problem. Now we've grown a lot and we can be a little bit more systematic about recruitment, and we're also more we have less issues training our Clojure people ourselves because the language gets out of your way very fast, and I think even if Nubank sucks up all the talent that there is in North America, it's still good for the language in the long run, and we can train more people. I think it's all good as long as the popularity of the language grows. There was some criticism about JS being good enough or better, and I think that was I think we simply disagree there in many ways. And then there were some comments on tooling and libraries. The libraries in the Clojure space are a little bit more raw and less polished than in the JavaScript scene because of just the sheer amount of people working on them. And it feels more like it's an offering of a set of tools rather than pre-packaged libraries that you interact with. So I think it's almost more a philosophical thing than anything else. So I asked them before this call, the current incarnation of the team, about the pros and cons of Clojure. And the pros are almost exclusively REPL-driven development and various articulations of the syntax being nice to work with. So concise code, clarity, and syntax, but REPL-driven development is what everyone answers. The old grumpy farts in Knivsta says that we should do strong typing. But sorry, that's my home place in Sweden. We should do strong typing, and I get it. You have a point. It would be nice. It's the same feedback on every Clojure project. I'm not sure it would be Clojure if it had strong typing, but that would be a thing that's on the negative side. I may or may not agree. There may or may not be other ways of handling that, but I understand that it's a point, and especially in a junior heavy team, strong typing and the tools around it could be helpful. I agree. And there's also a perceived lack of communicate or documentation, and this idea of like libraries being not super polished. All of that is true, no doubt about it. Still worth it in my book. You may or may not agree. There's a distinct attitude of let's get it done in the community, and I think that's in part why there's like less shiny libraries, because no one is sort of focused on maintaining a small library. They maintain them well, but there's small teams and everyone's busy. And I think there's a lot of good Clojure code out there that's not really wrapped up in a library yet because people move on to other things. I saw a lot of people disappear into the jungle of like convention over configuration in the Ruby on Rails days. I don't know if anyone remember that. But basically, it sort of, in my opinion, it changed a bunch of programmers from being able to write decent code to sitting there and Googling what the Rails way of writing the appropriate code would be. So it sort of, it took good programmers and made them insecure about what the best way of doing something that they knew how, already knew how to solve would be. And I dare say that because I was a part of that. And like, I sat there and was wondering about the most idiomatic Ruby code for everything. And then I worked with a guy at the time he was new in my project. It was a pretty big Rails app. And he didn't give an F about like idiomatic Ruby code. He sat there and basically typed out C code in the Ruby on Rails controller, and it just popped the bubble. And I accomplished Zen of programming after that. I got free from all the ideas about what the perfect code should be. Thank you, Peter. And there's a temptation of spending time researching what the idiomatic Clojure way of doing it is, but the idiomatic Clojure way of doing it is getting it done. There's so many ways of solving each problem that you should just get it done. And the idea there I'm trying to express is, do you want to build stuff, or do you want to Google how to build stuff? And with Clojure being such a powerful tool, there's always the just build and move on sort of option. I wanted to highlight a little bit more. I don't know, am I short on time? I don't know how long I've been going. I could probably move on a little bit longer. I want to highlight the joy aspect of programming. And I've been doing this for a long time now. I realized, okay, I'm getting old, guys. I realized that 25 years is not enough. I've been doing this for 30 years, I guess. I'm on my 40th year now, as my wife points out. And I'm excited I'm as excited regarding programming as I've ever been. Like, all traces of cynicism and tiredness is gone from me. And I no longer have the sense of like constantly having to patch a burning house. I think the long-term stability comes from the functional aspects of this. And the daily joy and excitement comes from the REPL and from playing around with the expressiveness of Clojure. And I frequently get these like small bouts of joy when I code, and when I literally rejoice when I see how short and concise some of the standard library functions are, and how well they play together. And I just feel gratitude to the people who've done this work. So I wanted to bring it.
Marcus, I just want to say you have 20 more minutes.
20 more minutes.
Yeah.
I got it. I think I can do it. Thank you. Feel free to ping me again when it's 5 minutes left or something.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're doing looking at some code, and this is along the aspect or the topic of joy and expressiveness. So one thing that I very much like and I rejoice in daily is that keywords are functions, and maps are functions too. So if you see, and this is a map, map literal, and it's called X. It has two keys in it, sum and another. They both map to a string. And there's a test here checking for equality just to prove that this is the same thing. And the first, the sum X retrieves the value of the key sum in the map of X. So the keyword is a function. So this is, for those of you who haven't seen this before, the first argument in a list that starts with parentheses is a function call. So you see it clearly on the get. So that means call the function get. So this is called the function of the keyword called sum on the map of X. And then the map, being a data type, is also a function. So if you call it, that also calls the get function with the key sum. And both of them obviously are the same as calling get from the map X with the keyword sum. And all of these three things are equivalent. They do the same thing. But it gives me options of how to express myself in code. And I'm trying to, in a somewhat contrived manner, illustrate why that matters. It's some code to find my Lamborghini car. And I don't have a Lamborghini. This was a made up thing, unfortunately. But it does change the semantics a little bit, like expired my car registration date, expired registration date my car, and expired get my car registration date. Like, some of these are easier to read than others. I think I vote for number 2, and most of my code is based off of number 2. But I acknowledge that there may be other options, there may be other opinions, but in this particular case, like it matters slightly, or it changes slightly how easy the code is to read. What is it that's expired? As soon as possible after expired, I want to see the thing that's expired, and that's a registration date. So I just love seeing that, or I love that I have options for that. The other thing is, so now you see the keywords here have slashes in them. That means that they're namespaced. So I can have a page event ID in one namespace, and it doesn't conflict with an event ID of another namespace. So if I need to merge a couple of maps, it won't be any conflicts. And in this case, I immediately see that this this code has to do with some database tables, and it's super clear to me what it does. And the fact that it's camel cased, or it's snake cased and not kebab cased, means it's coming from the database. That's not conventional in the Clojure space. Most people kebab case everything coming out of the database, but to me, it signals things, so I very quickly know where the data is from. Also, I know in the previous meetup, someone was asking about the presenter's favorite function, and here's juxt, and I happen to agree, it's one of my absolute favorites as well. It calls the functions after one at a time on the argument, and so we could unpack this a little bit, but basically, if you have a database row, it will call these functions one at a time, and the keywords representing the data are also functions that's called according to the previous slide that you saw. So I don't know, I just get really happy seeing this kind of code. Then we have some other ideas of the expressive freedom. All of these things do the same thing. If you're interested, we can unpack that too, but I'm going to move on for now. Another junior on my team said that Clojure is pretty concise on each line. You can easily tell what each line is doing because of keywords and abstraction. Hi, Matthew. That was in when I asked him what he liked about Clojure, and he commented, like, he made a PR like day 2 or something with a good change in it, because it sort of gets out of the way. Like, it's very easy to see what each row does, and I appreciate him trying to articulate that. Yeah, so the macro question, there's some, basically the teaching in the ecosystem is don't do macros. Like, you probably don't need to do them, and that's been true so far for us. But I think the macros should still be appreciated in that they improve the standard library. So I just wanted to comment a bit on that. This is a macro, the thread macro that we've seen before. That I think is a very good tool to reduce cognitive load. If you see the distance between the parameter a that's being passed as the last argument to the function map, thread last macro here makes us pass that sort of from the top instead and adds it onto at the bottom here. And you can see that there's like a concrete distance reduction. And I think that is concretely less things for your brain to have to keep track of. The distance between the two instances of A is smaller to the right. And not only like in graphical coordinates, but also in that it has twice as many, if not more, of statements in between, or expressions. And I think if you're able to maneuver around like that, in the end, in your code base, it's going to be a drastic reduction in how easy it is for your brain to parse code. I don't know if that made any sense, but I was excited about it. And then you can even improve it even more by using a partial. And some experienced Clojure developers may say that I should be doing a transducer instead. I still don't understand how to use them correctly. I hope to graduate to that one day. One thing that we noticed is a drastic reduction of skitfel, which is a highly technical Swedish term that I teach everyone on my team. It is literally, it means something like bullshit error, I think is the closest translation I've seen. It's defined as something that makes you question logic itself and all existing order of the universe, but when it is resolved, it was 100% completely uninteresting, but restores the order of the universe and logic itself. So I've noticed that stuff has just disappeared. That, like, spending 2 hours trying to figure out why something is broken, it's just gone. Like, we don't do that anymore. Yeah, so missing clutter, I spent, after having, done the switch to Clojure, I spent a long time looking at an SQL statement and I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. And it wouldn't compile, or it wouldn't, Postgres didn't accept it. It turned out that I'd forgotten the commas in between the values I was inserting, and I just couldn't see it. And it made me question what the value of those commas were. And if you don't know, the Clojure is very, very concise. Like, you don't have to use commas if you don't want to, and a bunch of other things you don't have to use. So commas for me then goes into the category of cruft, which according to hacker jargon file is the digital equivalence of dust that gathers under your bed, and the result of a shoddy construction or superfluous junk. And so I could interpret that as things that my brain has to parse that doesn't help my mission. So apparently commas is one of those things. And so I made a cruftometer, which is basically plotting or counting the amount of cruft in our big rewrite in Clojure and ClojureScript and our original code base in JavaScript. And so the yellow, the bright orange, I could have chosen the colors better, I guess. The bright orange yellowy thingy is from JavaScript, and the dark orange is from Clojure. And so you see that there's there's at least 24,000 something commas that I don't have to read when I read the code. And there's a bunch of, a lot less of quotes and semicolons and all of that. Yeah, so what I think when I see this graph is things my brain does not have to wrestle with in order to understand the code. Similarly, the comparison, I know this is apples to oranges. This is just lines of code from the same projects, the first JavaScript implementation. I would say, so you could always argue that it's easier to rewrite something and that you can make it more efficient. But I also think that the Clojure rewrite of this is actually a little bit ahead in features. So we've heard it before, like from the quote in the beginning of the talk, that it should be a factor of 5 difference, and that's true for us too. The amount of code lines is a factor of 5.35 difference, and that's also way less things for me to read, right? The word count is similar, 5.82 in difference. This is this is counting the amount of calls to function, how many times a function in our Clojure code base was called, and just sorting it by amount of calls. And you see some function here called 900 times in one of the code bases, and then Drastic drops. The reason I wanted to highlight that was I have a thesis that I think you could prove that the standard library is efficient by seeing a lot of standard library functions here. And what I want to go towards is figuring out what is the most efficient way of learning Clojure. And if you want to work on my team, these are the top 10 or top something of each project. The interesting part here is that the middle column is actually a front-end project. So it relies a lot on anonymous functions, probably to handle events and effects. So it has fn, which declares a function at the top. And the other one has defn, which declares a named function. So this would be an anonymous function. This is a macro that turns into a def and a fn. So, and this piece here is my answer to what is the 2080 rule of Clojure if you want to work with us. 2080 being the idea that there's usually a way to do 20% of the work and get 80% of the results. So this represents 80% of all function calls in our 3 distinct Clojure code bases. And now I'm going to do a speed run of all of these to explain them each a singular one. That was a joke. I'm not going to do that. That's another talk. There was one here that stood out for me that I didn't know when I put this together, which was fnil. It's right here. So I highlighted that because I wanted to know what it did, and it perfectly illustrates the joy of working with Clojure. So fnil, this is typically what you would see when I'm poking around in code. You see a comment block, and then you see a bunch of things playing around with something. So Clojure REPL doc fnil explains what it does. I should probably have actually included the documentation here, but it returns the function that's called if it returns a function that can handle the nil case as an argument. So if you have a function that says hello or formats a string based on the argument, and you do an fnil of that function, it gives it a default argument that's called when the argument is nil. So hello baby Yoda returns hello baby Yoda, hello nil returns hello null. Hello 2, which is the fnil version of the function, with nil returns hello, what's up? Because I give it a default argument. And I would previously have implemented this with an or, as you can see here, but now I learned something new because this case was way cleaner. So that's fnil for you, and that's just a typical example of the joy that's in the Clojure code base. You can find stuff like this. Okay, thanks, bye. No, yeah, so we intend to keep growing. We're working on ridiculously exciting problems. And we're, if you want to work with us and you're a good Clojure developer, please reach out. We are looking for a high profile recruitment in the form of an engineering manager that will work between me and the dev team to keep everyone happy. So shameless plug, if you know someone who we should talk to, or if you're that person, please reach out. And that's it. I think I made it within 20 minutes. Did I?
Yes, you did. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Martin. You did it in 10 minutes.
Awesome. Thank you.
You
Yeah,
speed it up.
a bit fast maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very nice presentation. Of course, I have some questions. What would be the key things switching to Clojure? I mean, you made a long presentation, but you made a presentation. What's like the key takeaways here?
I think the key takeaway is that it's possible, that's easier than you think it is, and it's worth it every step of the way that you can do. So that would be the key takeaways.
Yeah.
Probably play around with Clojure for 2 weeks yourself, and then push it to the team because it's so fun. I also think that most developers are addicted to novelty. So when you present them with something exotic, they get like, oh, hey, what's this? You know, every project, everyone always wants to use a new database, you know, so you can sort of sell it into their dopamine circuitry if you intend to. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. How come you ended up in Houston? Was it the weather?
Yeah. So I tell everyone here that it's the opposite of what it's like in Sweden. It's everyone stays in the summertime because it's so hot outside. So I think, but the difference is that it's bright. So in Sweden, everyone stays in the wintertime, but it's dark.
Yes.
And so it's slightly less depressive here. But no, it's because of the medical center. So my co-founder is a doctor. We're in the medical field, and Houston has one of the largest medical centers in the world called the Texas Medical Center. It's literally Stadsdel, a part of a city that's made up of hospitals and hospitals only. And so he ended up here. He married a Swedish lady that came to our wedding, and I was looking for the next thing to do, and
Voila.
Our wives are friends. Yeah. So that's a story there. Yeah, maybe for the next time.
Yeah, really interesting. Didn't know that. You talked also a little bit, and this is also my experience, that once you grow a team enough, you can start like onboarding people with zero experience in the programming language that you work with. I previously worked with Erlang, and then we onboarded people from, in the beginning it was tough to find people, but as soon as you come over a certain size, it's like, whatever, we just find good people, and if they're willing, we'll teach them.
Exactly.
No, that's my also.
Absolutely, and I think it also has to do with our confidence in the language and the tooling and all of that. And I think we started doing that pretty early. But I think looking back, I think the thing that's the painful, the thing that could use some more work in that area is like tooling and the flow of development. And I think we're still a little bit behind there.
Yeah.
So the language itself is super easy to pick up and it's easy to communicate. But I know, like, sometimes I discover that someone is like actively, restarting the JVM every time, and I'm like, what are you doing? You're missing the whole point. And like, what are you talking about? And so the communication of tooling and I guess mentorship is it comes with a cost, basically, onboarding new people, but it's possible. That's my sort of that's the hope I could communicate. It's possible. It's easier than what I thought it was, and it's still, there's some work to be done there.
Yeah. Good. Another thing, how much math do you know? Do you need to know math to start in Clojure?
No, no, I don't, yeah. So it may
Typical
actually be
question,
hurtful.
but
It may be a bad thing to know math because of the prefix notation.
oh, okay.
So the first time you write an expression, you start with the operator. So 2 plus 2 in Clojure is parenthesis plus 2 2. And it will take you around 38 days to figure out what you're doing wrong because you're so used to doing the other way around. And then after you realize how easy it is to always have the same order of things. But short answer is no. Yeah, I don't need any
Yeah.
math, I think. Yeah.
Let me see. A lot of people thanking for your nice talk here in the chat.
Oh,
Was that
awesome.
one?
Thank you.
Yes, you're very welcome. I have another like question thought, like raw tools instead of framework is a feature. Instead of using frameworks, you put your own raw tools together to become. I've actually seen this. When I started out my junior career, I was like, oh, let's go frameworks, and after a while, like throw away the frameworks, use separate libraries or tools instead.
Exactly. I 100% agree, and that's probably the largest culture shock coming from like for modern like code school JavaScript people who are like used to downloading an npm package and it's like no one does that in the Clojure space and no one really cares, and it's like I used to yeah it was a big freedom and a big step for me to realize that I'm on the library side of libraries versus frameworks. But I think Clojure is a third option. It's like it's not even libraries. It's like just get the job done and because the standard library would be like the library. So most of it happens there. Yeah, I
Cool.
guess I talked about that in the beginning, but yeah, I agree very much.
Yeah, then we got one more comment here, like from Oscar. Lisp seems like they need fewer languages iterations.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, it's because it's said that it's so simple that it was discovered rather than invented.
Okay.
It's on a different level. It's on a different level, guys. Like
Yeah.
I don't know what to say. Like I have religious feelings about it. Like it's blowing my mind, and I see people all around me who has had the same experience because of the simplicity. I'm so sick of learning new things. I'm so sick of complicated things, and it just resonates with me. And I'm not saying that's for everyone, and that's okay. But I agree, and I think the slightly less emotional answer is yeah, it's because of the macro system probably. Like if you need a language feature, it's like yeah, build it.
Yeah, I'm gonna see if there's more questions here. Not more questions, but thank you very much for your presentations. Your
Yeah,
presentation,
absolutely.
Marcus.
Thank
It
you.
was really nice, and really nice that you can join us from Houston also.
Absolutely, anytime. And like I've come up with at least 2 or 3 different topics after
Oh,
this. And,
cool.
I'm super grateful that you guys put this, together. And I think more people talking about functional programming. I was a little bit disappointed that it wasn't about funk and progressive music because I'm a bass player too. But functional programming would be the thing that could trump those things. So
Maybe,
funk
maybe.
for Sweden. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you very much. And with that said, thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. In October 26th, we're back with the 9th meetup this year. And then we'll have a presentation in OCaml and then a presentation around Erlang. Check it out. I've already published it on the meetup page. And then we'll run one more in November and then one more in December. So if you have anything you want to present or you know someone that can or should present, get them in touch with me and we'll put them on. And as I said to Marcus before we started this, it's like this is a meetup. So even if you never presented before, you're welcome. That's the idea. It's a meetup. Come on and present your things. With that said, thank you everyone for watching, and please remember to subscribe in YouTube and to join our meetup on the meetup community group. Thank you very much, and thanks for tonight. Goodbye, everyone.